So I want to welcome you all and thank you for coming. One of the great honors that I have as the Associate Dean for the school is to help to convene important conversations. The School of Public and Environmental Affairs tries to train and educate students around good public policy, and so those policy discussions sometimes can be on complex issues such as the one we're going to be talking about tonight. So the police officer body-worn cameras, trends and best practices, of course, is one of those public policy issues that we can, I think, usefully discuss, and so I'm glad to have you all here. I want to thank a number of people that made this possible. First of all, the Central Indiana Community Foundation, and in particular Alicia Collins and Brian Payne. Thank you so much for your support. Chief Roach and all of the IMPD officers that are here. We appreciate you coming out. Eskenazi Hospital, we appreciate their allowing us to use this facility. This is my first time in this room. It sure is a nice facility, so I hope they'll let us come back. Also like to thank Associate Professor Wynn Spia Jeremy Carter, who helped organize this, and thanks also to the three particular panelists. And just to briefly introduce them, Kristen Cosgrove is a Special Projects Manager for the Cincinnati Police Department and was involved in the implementation of its body-worn camera program. Dr. Cynthia Lum is a Professor of Criminology, Law, and Society at George Mason University and is a researcher that's nationally known for policing issues, security, and evidence-based crime policy. And finally, Nick Zahowski is a strategic advisor for the Seattle Police Department and is currently acting as the program manager for the SPD's body-worn video program. So thank you all for making short, medium, and very long range trips to come join us. I'd also like to thank the staff members from SPIA who helped to make this event possible, and most of them are out of the room, otherwise I'd have them raise their hands, but thank you very much to those folks. As you all know, these events don't happen without the behind-the-scenes work that they would be doing. I would also like to point out that we're going to be having another forum on a similar topic on June 28th, and this is going to be here in this room. Is that correct? Here, yes, so we'll be here in this room, and it's going to be on the topic of violence reduction, trends and best practices, and we'll have some additional information on that coming up soon. So June 28th here in this room. So again, it's an honor for SPIA to be able to facilitate tonight's discussion, and I don't want to spend too much time here, but the use of body cameras is, of course, an issue that is worthy of discussion, and so I would anticipate that we'll have some really good conversation tonight. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Chief Roach. Either one, if you got the.
Can you hear me? All right. Well, first of all, I appreciate you all coming out. We had a discussion with IUPUI and SPIA probably middle of last year, end of last year, about the opportunity, and again, because of CICF and their funding, to have a couple discussions around some serious matters that we as a police department and a community are dealing with. And we selected body-worn cameras and then violence reduction. I'm hoping to sit here and listen like you all. I was a middle child and have older siblings. And it was always, there was a benefit to watch them do things that were good and watch them fall sometimes and learn from that. And not that there were any mistakes made in these programs, but I'm sure they learned a lot, and we're hoping to glean that as a police department. I do want to make clear that the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department is not introducing body-worn cameras next month. We had a pilot program a couple years ago, had some favorable results. We actually had an RFP out, and the funding just wasn't there. There's a lot of technology behind body-worn cameras, and part of the message here, which these folks will explain very well, is that it's not a matter of just buying a camera and placing it on an officer and calling that a program. There's so much that surrounds that, and we were hoping today to be able to communicate to the community what all surrounds that, what those costs are. We as a city are increasing our technological ability, and I think we're creating that base so that we can ingest all the video. And so we do see a time in the future possibly officers having body-worn cameras. And so we think it's important. These people have been studying this and looking at these programs for years. And I thought it was important that we as a police department, as a city, begin to have those discussions, understanding what can and can't be done, really outline true expectations, both from the police department and the community, and what those costs are, and then move forward that way. One of the questions I was asked by the media before I came in here is does that mean that in next year's budget we will see body-worn cameras? Here in the city of Indianapolis, we're focused on increasing the number of our police officers. We've done that for the last 2 years. That is the plan this year and next year. So I don't know that we can do both, but I thought it was important as the leader of the police department that I be able to have those discussions with the controller's office within the city about when we do it, what those costs are, both on the front end and those continual costs, and then those personnel costs that it takes to really run the program the way it should be. So I want to thank the people on the panel that came from Cincinnati and Seattle and Washington, and very experienced, and I'm glad that they were here and happy to participate in this. And I'll turn it over to Jeremy Carter.
Thank you, Chief. Quick overview on what to expect this evening, and to piggyback on something Chief Roach mentioned. I think what will be evident tonight from the speakers is that a lot of time, effort, planning, and researching went into their now successful body-worn camera programs. Between 3, 5, 6 years of doing due diligence to get to the point where they're at, where they actually had cameras on officers. And so I think to speak to the chief's point, this is an opportunity for everyone to learn and begin that process. And so what we'll do, I know this seems very formal. I mean, I'm a professor and I'm in a suit. And so we do not mean it to be that way. This is certainly intended to be a dialogue later on the evening. And what we'll be doing is Dr. Lum will be providing an evidence base, the what we know and what we don't know regarding what to expect from body-worn cameras. And then, of course, we will have Nick and Kristen provide their perspectives in terms of the challenges and the benefits that they've experienced in trying to adopt these technologies. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Lum. Oh, and I should say at the end of the discussions is when the Q&A will occur. We plan to hopefully have about 30 minutes for question and answers, and at that point we'll float a mic around and hopefully get to some of the questions I know you all are interested in.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeremy. Thank you, Chief. And thank you all for being here today. I have to say this is my first time in Indianapolis, and so I was really excited to be visiting, and your city has some really beautiful architectural elements, so I'm sorry I have to leave it so quickly tomorrow, but thank you again for having me today to present. Let me just say that body-worn cameras is one of the most rapidly diffusing technologies in policing, in contemporary policing. I have not seen this type of diffusion except really with license plate readers, which is another technology that I do a lot of evaluation in. And there's just such great, I would say, high expectations of body-worn cameras from both police and communities. A great deal of money is being spent on body-worn cameras, not only to acquire them, but also to use them, implement them, and sustain them over periods of time. So it's really important that we are discussing it today. I would also argue that body-worn cameras are such an important focus point for discussion and research, because Technology research, and I'll kind of get to this more at the end, but technology research really helps to reveal a lot of deeper aspects of policing in society. And this is not just technology research on body-worn cameras, but research on technology more generally. I think this research provides a window into not only police operations, but just more generally relationships between police and people. So I find this body-worn camera research fascinating, as well as other types of technology research. Let me just begin by saying that much of my work is really grounded in this idea of evidence-based policing. This concept of evidence-based policing is simply that research should at least have a seat at the table when it comes to police policy and practice. And I think policing, and not just policing, education, medicine, public health, have really learned the hard way in many cases. Things that we thought would lead to certain outcomes did not lead to those outcomes, and in some cases caused harmful effects. We have tons of these examples actually in criminal justice, which is not positive. So I think that research is really important in helping to connect outcomes with interventions and with policies and practices like body-worn camera use. And in particular, it's important when thinking about acquiring body-worn cameras. So this is on the minds of the police department here, as well as many other police departments in the United States, and the research really, I would argue, is very important to consider. I'd like for all of you to keep in mind 3 ideas as I go through the research today. With regards to what we know about body-worn cameras. The first is that body-worn cameras have high costs and expectations. It's too costly to take guesses about whether body-worn cameras will lead to one outcome or another. The second is that I do a lot of research in technologies for police, and almost all of it continues to find unintended effects of technology. Technology always leads to some unintended consequence that either the citizens, communities, or the police are not anticipating. There's many reasons for this, but I think the most compelling reason is that technology does not shape police agencies. Police agencies shape technology. And so technology is brought in and it's filtered through very stable and existing police cultures and organizational systems, and the outputs that come from their use are determined by those things. So I think it's really important to remember that. And finally, technology is almost always purchased and adopted absent of outcomes-based research. This is a problem in which academics have to share the burden as well. For many reasons, we often are evaluating technologies after the fact. Now, there is some good news with body-worn cameras. Researchers are very interested in studying body-worn cameras, so there's actually a lot more research available for you all to see compared to some of the other rapidly diffusing technologies like license plate readers, for example. The rapid adoption of body-worn cameras really began after Trayvon Martin in 2012, and also the events of Michael Brown in 2014 and Freddie Gray in 2015. And I think researchers have really tried to keep up. As you can see here, we now have this comprehensive review that I'm about to share with you. We now have almost 60 empirical studies on body-worn camera research, and that's pretty good. Let me also say that, like body-worn camera adoption, the research has not been just concentrated in the largest police agencies or the largest jurisdictions. Much of the research is taking place in smaller to medium-sized jurisdictions as well. So this is unusual because most of the research that I am familiar with in terms of evidence-based policing tends to occur in very large agencies. So this is very positive. The research is, I would say, could be grouped into these 6 areas. There's some exceptions, but for the most part, research that we have on body-worn cameras focuses on the impacts of the cameras on officer behaviors and officer attitudes. This is the largest chunk of research that's out there. And then we have not so much research, but we still have some studies that are focused on body-worn cameras and their impacts on citizen behaviors, on citizen and community attitudes, on investigations, and also on organizational impacts. Let me also say that almost all of these studies that I'm about to talk about in summary, I won't go through every single study today, that would take hours, but they have been done in the field between researchers and police practitioners and community members. So this is also another positive aspect of this evidence base. The police and community groups are very interested in finding out what are the impacts of body-worn cameras. Okay, so to get into just some summary of these 6 areas, what do we know about the impacts of body-worn cameras on officer behaviors? About 24 studies have looked at the impact of body-worn cameras on officer behaviors. Most of these studies have focused on a few key concepts. The first is the impact of the cameras on the police officer's interaction with the person. Either his or her professionalism, procedural justice, misconduct, rudeness, and the measure by which these things are examined are usually complaints. Research tends to indicate that officers who are wearing body-worn cameras seem to have less complaints than those who are not wearing body-worn cameras. And these are pretty good studies, so I won't go into all the methodology behind some of these studies, but many of these are randomized controlled experiments and quasi-experimental studies. So in other words, they have a lot of believability to them. Now, some of this effect of the complaints being lower for officers who have body-worn cameras, some of this might be a reduction in frivolous complaints. Some of this could be a change in the officer's behavior because he or she knows that they're being recorded. And other studies have indicated that there could be some shifting between a formal complaint system to more of a negotiated informal approach to complaints on the street. The question is, we don't know which ones of these are. So we know that complaints are going down, but we're not quite sure what is causing the complaints to go down. And that is going to be the important next step in the research in this area. Also, I think there's a question about whether or not complaints accurately measure the quality of officer-citizen interactions. Very few interactions actually result in a complaint. And so whether or not that actually measures the quality of the interaction or the accountability of officers to that interaction is really an open question. Also, the studies tend to focus on whether or not body-worn cameras have an impact on use of force. About half of the studies specifically focused on use of force show that officers wearing cameras tend to use less force than officers not wearing cameras. But we also have a whole other half of these studies that show no difference between officers with and without body-worn cameras in terms of their use of force, or that use of force difference disappears over time. Barak Ariel just came out with a new study in which he was showing that officers that have greater discretion in turning on and off those cameras tend to have more use of force than those officers who have much less discretion in turning on and off their body-worn cameras. Okay. Again, I'm sorry, this is the biggest group, so I'm going to spend just a little more time on it than the other areas. In terms of officer discretion to cite or arrest, there was an initial belief, a hypothesis, that officers wearing body-worn cameras would become more legalistic. They would arrest more or cite more because they were being recorded. So they were less likely to use discretion in their arrest powers. This research is all over the map. Some studies show that arrests and citations increase. Others show that arrests and citations decrease, and some show no impact. So there is no strong evidence that arrests and citations will increase or decrease if officers adopt body-worn cameras. Okay, some folks have had a concern about something called depolicing, like officers pulling back from policing because, and especially proactive policing, because they're wearing body-worn cameras. There's really no strong evidence of depolicing, although we need much more studies in these areas. There's some evidence that shows stop, question, and frisk decline when officers wear body-worn cameras, but stop, question, and frisk have been declining for the last 5 years or so due to many other reasons than body-worn cameras. And so, but in terms of officer-initiated field contacts and encounters, there are at least 2 studies that show those increase with officers who wear body-worn cameras. Let me just say that, again, it's not important whether or not proactivity increases or decreases. What's really important is what type of proactivity increases or decreases. So, for example, if broken windows arrests decline because officers wear body-worn cameras, I'm not so concerned, because we now have a lot of research that shows that broken windows arrests did not have a deterrent effect, and it caused a lot of problems with community members. But if proactive policing, such as problem solving, goes down, or if place-oriented approaches to police proactivity declines, those are strong infrastructures for community-oriented policing, and I would be concerned if those things decline. So it's about which types of proactivity are declining with body-worn cameras. Here's the most, I think, saddest part of this area of research. We do not know about this. We do not know the impacts of body-worn cameras on implicit or explicit bias or differential treatment. This is one of the reasons why body-worn cameras were pushed by citizens, because they believed that it might lead to less disparity in policing or greater fairness in policing, especially with communities of color. And we just don't know. I think as academics, we really have to get on this particular question. Okay. The next 5 areas are much shorter. We don't have as much research in these areas, except for this one. There is a ton of survey research on officer attitudes about body-worn cameras. Unfortunately, a lot of this is very weak research. But I'm going to just give you some themes that I think are pretty consistent from some of this officer attitudes about body-worn camera research. Many studies show that over a very brief time, officers grow to like cameras. They are influenced by other officers and agencies that like those cameras. Officers with experience with body-worn cameras like them better than officers who have not yet experienced body-worn cameras. And the primary reason that we're finding from the higher quality survey, interview, and focus group research is that officers see body-worn cameras as protecting themselves against the public and against frivolous complaints. The second reason that officers are giving is primarily that it helps them bring evidence for particular crimes that they're trying to charge. I think this is probably one of the most challenging findings in the body-worn camera research. Body-worn cameras were pushed by the public as primarily an accountability mechanism, and usually accountability systems and technologies are not so quickly well-liked by officers, which calls into question whether or not body-worn cameras can be effective accountability mechanisms. There's also a great deal of incongruence between the officers and their supervisors and command staff about expectations of body-worn cameras. Supervisors and commanders tend to view body-worn cameras positively. They see it as an accountability mechanism. Officers tend to resist some of these views. Again, this incongruence is not uncommon. This has existed a long time in not just policing, but many other organizations between line workers and supervisors and commanders. But what is important to point out is that body-worn camera research can be a lens to see this incongruence and then use that understanding in terms of when agencies do adopt body-worn cameras, how they're going to mitigate some of that incongruence, which can cause a lot of strife in organizations. Okay. Sorry. All right. Citizen behavior. Okay, what do we know about this? We know much less about this. There's about 12 studies now, research studies, on the impacts of body-worn cameras on citizen behavior. Most focus on the impact of body-worn cameras on suspect compliance. These are pretty high-quality studies, again, quasi-experimental and randomized controlled trials. And these studies indicate there's really no differences between officers wearing body-worn cameras and those that do not wear body-worn cameras with regards to suspect resistance to them. In fact, there's a recent, very high-quality study that shows that officers with body-worn cameras have higher assaults on them than officers that do not wear body-worn cameras. We don't know why that is the case, but one study has seen that trend. In terms of behavioral impacts with regards to other things, these have been less studied, but I want to point out a couple of them that are important. The first is with regards to citizen willingness to call the police. We have one study here which has found that low crime places, so places that are relatively very low in crime counts, that have officers with body-worn cameras, seem to be more willing to call the police with crime. However, places that have high crime show no difference between places that have officers with body-worn cameras and those that do not in terms of willingness to call the police. So this feeling that body-worn cameras might impact people's willingness to call the police may not be as salient of an argument as some have made it out to be. The second is kind of more is interesting. I study a lot of I study investigations a lot, and clearance rates are kind of on the decline, unfortunately, in a lot of major cities, especially in homicide and violence. So cooperation may be very key to stopping this decline. We aren't sure whether or not body-worn cameras on officers or detectives affects that cooperation. Okay. In terms of citizen and community attitudes, there is a general positive feeling among people about body-worn cameras. There is a support for police to purchase body-worn cameras, and there are high expectations. With the caveat, we now have studies that show that there are less positive views about the promise of body-worn cameras amongst people who are young, who are non-white, or who are living in fear of crime. These are also people who may have the most interaction with officers with body-worn cameras. So this reflects, by the way, a more broad area of research. There's still great disparities between the legitimacy afforded to the police by various groups, in particular between whites and non-whites. In terms of improved satisfaction with specific encounters, the findings are a bit less optimistic. Citizen satisfaction with a specific incident or a specific exchange is really conditioned by the officer's actions, how they spoke to that individual, how they treated that individual. That's what determines citizen satisfaction, not wearing body-worn cameras. And sure enough, the studies in this area do not seem to indicate much difference. And these are high-quality studies in terms of a person's satisfaction with the specific encounter as to whether or not an officer is wearing or not wearing a body-worn camera. In many cases, people don't even remember if an officer was wearing a camera or not when they're asked shortly after their experience with an officer. And finally, we don't know too much about the privacy impacts of body-worn cameras. Okay, in terms of the impacts of body-worn cameras on investigations, one thing we don't know about, and then I'll tell you what we do know about, but one thing we don't know about is whether body-worn cameras can improve investigations of officer-involved incidents. And this is one of the reasons why body-worn cameras were pushed by communities and citizens, but we really don't understand this area too much. I can tell you one thing, though. I've done recently a national survey of prosecutors and asked them how they're using body-worn camera footage. And the vast majority, it's some very high percentage, like 97%, are saying that they're using body-worn camera footage to prosecute people, not necessarily to prosecute officers for misconduct. There's a couple of weaker studies that seem to indicate that body-worn cameras can increase detection and clearing of some crimes, but these studies occur in England, and so whether or not they can be generalized to the US is questionable. Where we do have information is on domestic violence, and this area is kind of interesting. Body-worn camera footage appears to increase the likelihood of an investigation, charging, and court processing of domestic violence, in particular in getting guilty pleas and also gaining convictions when victims don't want to cooperate. Again, I urge you to think about what this means. The research that we have broadly on domestic violence shows that arrest and convictions may have negative impacts for victims of domestic violence. Further, we are also interested in whether justice processes improves outcomes for victims. Sometimes those outcomes are not conviction. They are empowerment of the victim. They are the safety of the individual. And so whether or not we see this effect of body-worn cameras on domestic violence cases as positive, I think is, could be debatable. Okay, finally, we only have 4 studies on the impact of body-worn cameras on policing systems and the organization. I just want to say, while we do have some studies on training, it's mostly about how body-worn cameras are used in training, not necessarily whether they are effective in improving retention of officers during training or whether they improve the quality of academy or in-service training. These other areas, the impact on agency policy development and reform, impact on accountability or disciplinary systems, the impact on complaint processes, not the impacts on complaints, the impacts on the process by which people go to the police to generate a complaint, the impact on managerial systems and first, second line supervision, costs and workload, these areas are unknown. I do want to mention, though, and emphasize one thing in this area. Technology research and policing often again, and I mentioned this at the beginning, often again finds that technologies don't reform organizations, that organizations shape technologies and bend that technology towards its will. So for example, if body-worn cameras are expected to strengthen accountability in policing, accountability structures in policing, cameras themselves won't likely do this if the current accountability mechanisms in a police agency are weak. The same is true for training or supervision, or you can substitute any of the police systems into that statement. So for example, mentorship and relationships between first-line supervisors and officers. This is key to accountability. Yet if a police doesn't value that, an agency doesn't value that relationship or have systems of mentorship in place to foster that kind of relationship, body-worn cameras will not be used in those ways, even if they're adopted by the agency. By the way, the same is true. Most of my work is in the area of deterrence and crime prevention. The same is true with technologies that try to control crime or try to address and prevent crime. If officers aren't oriented towards preventing crime, they will take a preventative technology and they will use it in reactive ways. So this is a very common finding with regards to technology research. So just to close, I just want to say that the police and the public have very high expectations of body-worn cameras. The challenge is whether or not these are actually achieved. So, for example, can we reduce the use of force and also formal complaints? Okay, maybe we can with body-worn cameras, but does this improve accountability and supervision? Have those things been strengthened? That's 2 different questions. We may be able to reduce complaints, and citizens might generally like cameras, but does this actually affect the quality of exchanges between police and people, or the quality of information that citizens are giving the police or cooperating with the police about? One expectations by communities of color is that body-worn cameras will level the playing field and increase fairness. We don't know if that's necessarily true. In fact, we've had vehicle cameras for quite some time in police agencies, but Gallup polls continue to show consistent disparities and differential trust between white and non-white communities of their police. I also think, and this is maybe this is for another day and for another debate, but I think there is something fundamentally amiss in an advanced democracy when both the police and also the public are looking to cameras to protect themselves from one another. There's something that we really have to have a strong discourse about with regards to that issue. And finally, the question is less about how body-worn cameras can somehow shape or change the police. Most likely, organizations shape body-worn camera use, given their existing systems and cultures. So how can agencies work with their communities by strategizing to get the most out of body-worn cameras? This is hard, because I think sometimes the police and people have competing interests and expectations about technologies, about policing, about safety more generally. So I hope this review has provided you with some food for thought. I thank you for listening. I look forward to your questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lum, for that comprehensive review. I think that what was highlighted there was the reality that we have many more question marks than we do exclamation marks regarding the impact of body-worn cameras, which then I think transitions as well into the discussions from our folks from Seattle and Cincinnati as they talk about some of the challenges and processes and experiences they've had when implementing their program. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Nick Zahowski from Seattle Police Department. Again, Nick is the manager of Seattle's body-worn video camera program. Thank you.
Good evening. My name's Nick, and I'm the Body-Worn Video Program Manager at the Seattle Police Department. Thank you for inviting me to this forum. It's always interesting to hear how other cities have implemented body-worn cameras, and also to listen to the questions that I get as a city is like Indianapolis is thinking about the process of adopting body cameras. When we were in the planning stage for body cameras in Seattle, we talked to Cincinnati, and they gave us great information about how they move forward with their program. And so I think it's really useful to have this dialogue, especially in the community, as you think about the issues surrounding body cameras. So I'm going to walk you a little bit through what we did in Seattle. By no means is this a presentation on what Indianapolis should do if they have body cameras. It's really just to talk about what we did and get people thinking about how certain agencies do things. But I really think it is up to the community to think about. There's different communities have different concerns and different issues, and so that's why it's great to have this dialogue as you move forward. So in August of 2010, an SPD officer fatally shot John T. Williams. He was a deaf Native American woodcarver, pretty well known in the Seattle community. And as you can see here from the Seattle Times, this resulted in protests and was a catalyst for the Department of Justice to come into the Seattle Police Department and initiate a consent agreement with the department. And the primary reason being excessive use of force and SPD. So I'm not going to go through the video of this incident, but this is a screenshot from the in-car video system, which we've had in Seattle for many years, at the exact moment of the shooting. So the car is parked. This is the direction that the in-car video is facing. This is the exact moment of the shooting. As you can see, the bystander reacting to the shooting, but you can't see any of the shooting occurring. Right? It's off to the right here. A few days, about a week or so after the shooting, this is a column by Danny Westneat, who's one of I would say, the top columnists in the city, calling for body cameras. And this is 2010, so this is pretty early on in the process. And he says that, we need to see what police see, and talks about the issue of body cameras. It's been a long journey from 2010 to 2018. It took about 7 years for us to fully implement our body what we call body-worn video, because it's not just the camera, right? It's the video that's resulting from it. It's taken a while for this to be implemented fully with the frontline officers in Seattle Police Department. So this is a screenshot. Again, I'm not going to show the video, but from a recent fatal officer-involved shooting. Officers had the in-car video rolling as well as the body camera videos. It's hard to see in the screenshot, but the car is surrounded by about, gosh, I don't know, 4 or 5 officers. The suspect is rooting around in the back seat for a gun, and you can see there's multiple angles here. He roots around for about 19 seconds, which is an eternity, really, and trying to find his gun and ignoring the officer's commands to show his hands, and eventually, unfortunately, the officers end up shooting and killing the suspect. With in-car video, we would not have had this angle, right? It provides a different perspective. The in-car video angle is straightforward. You cannot see in the car, right? So this is one primary reason why we implemented body-worn video. It gives another perspective from the officer. It's a very visceral picture of officer interacting with the public. So we do a lot of talks with community groups with the body-worn video program, and one of the things that we always start off with is the goals of the program, and I read it directly. And so the goal of the body-worn video program in Seattle is to enhance public trust in the Seattle Police Department and provide greater transparency into officer actions. Recording law enforcement interactions between officers and members of the public provides valuable information for officer accountability and effective criminal investigations. So as Dr. Lum talked about, there's a lot of research mixed about use of force, and reducing use of force wasn't the primary goal for the Seattle Police Department, right? The primary goal is to provide another record of that officer-public interaction, and there's many uses for it, right? But it's an opportunity to have a record of that incident and for the public to be able to see that interaction. And thus provide greater transparency into the interactions between the officers and the public, and hopefully increase public trust. So one of the other things I talk about in community forums is about our policy, when officers turn the cameras on and when they turn them off. And I should say that really there's some common themes among policies throughout the country, but I think it's really important for each police department and each community to develop their own policies and to be comfortable with them. So Seattle police officers do not have the cameras on for the entire 9-hour shift, right? That's a 9-hour shift is a lot of video, very difficult to locate a specific incident in 9 hours of video, very difficult to store it and retrieve it. So essentially what the officers do is they start recording when they're doing police work, right? When they're dispatched to a 911 call, when they're doing a traffic or a Terry stop, Terry being a reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. They view criminal activity and so on. And when they stop recording, the officer has completed the investigation, or there's little possibility that the officer has further contact with any person in the event. And another piece that's specific to Washington State and Washington State law, if a resident can direct an officer to turn off the camera before they enter into a private residence, right? So the owner of a house or someone who has a right to be in that residence can direct. The officer will ask for their permission, and if they do not give the permission, then the officer has to turn the camera off or talk to people outside of that residence. So that's the one area in the policy where a member of the public can direct an officer to stop recording. We do have some officer discretion, which is different from some other agencies, and I should say some of this discretion comes from state law, but also some of our community input about the policy. There's concerns about victims or witnesses. So if in the right-hand box, when the officer can turn off the video if they think it would impede or limit the cooperation of a victim or a witness, cultural religious objections, child or sexual assault victim interviews, death notifications, natural death scenes, and not recording in restrooms, jails, medical facilities, therapeutic counseling, that sort of thing. Again, inside a private residence if directed so, but also lawfully exercising the freedom of speech, press, association, or assembly of religion. So in other words, at a protest, when it's peaceful, officers are not recording with their body cameras. But if there's criminal activity occurring, then they will turn them on. So if you remember from 2010, the headline was, "We need to see what the police see." So this is 7 years later. Should we see everything a cop sees? This was a New York Times Magazine article about body-worn video in Seattle, and I think is indicative of the journey that the department traveled from, we need to see everything a cop sees, to kind of like, well, do we really? And the privacy issues that body-worn cameras raise. So part of the issue that we have in Seattle is that the Washington state laws is one of, if not the most open records, one of the most open public records laws in the country, right? So any video that we produce that's not part of an active investigation, that's really narrowly defined, is available to the public. The legislature did pass some laws specifically for body-worn video, restricting, protecting people's identity for sexual assault victims and domestic violence victims, health information, as you saw from not recording in hospitals or treatment facilities, dead bodies, as well as sexual situations or nudity. In those instances, we still release the video, but we redact or blur parts of the video that might identify someone or that would be offensive to the general public, right? But mostly the state law dictates that we give out pretty much any video that is requested from us. So I think there's a balancing act. This is my poor attempt at a scale or a seesaw. The balancing the transparency and privacy, right? If you have total transparency, privacy suffers. If you have total privacy, then transparency suffers. And so what we're trying to do is figure out, how do we balance those two? How do we make the video transparent to the public so they can see what our officers are doing and the good work that they're doing, while at the same time maintaining privacy around an individual, and especially victims and witnesses, right? So our first attempt at balancing the scale. Some of you might have heard about our YouTube channel. This was in an early pilot that we did, and I believe it was 2014. What we did was we took every video that the officers were recording and we pushed it out to a YouTube channel. We stripped the audio, and we did a blur, a full blur, what we call the shower curtain blur, right? So you couldn't really see any identifying information and you couldn't hear anything. So we thought, this is great, we'll put it out, we'll have total transparency. And the comment there on the bottom, which I thought is very astute, it says, what an absolute waste of time and money. Transparency means the ability to see without special effort. These videos are useless with a blur and no sound. Pretty good point. We no longer do this. The videos are still up there. You can go to our YouTube page and see this, but I think it is fairly useless in terms of seeing what's going on. So this is our current attempt at balancing the scale. When a video is requested, we redact those individuals that need to be protected per state law. So this is a screenshot from a simulation of a domestic violence incident. These are all SPD officers. Note that the victim on the upper right is redacted or blacked out, right? And we're protecting her identity. Anytime she says her name, the audio is stripped out. Any identifying information like birth date, and so forth, or driver's license number are taken out. The number on the apartment door is blurred out. But if you'll notice, the officer and the suspect are not blurred out, right? There's no protection for their identities under state law, so we released this video. So we feel like this balances the scale a little bit better, provides that transparency and privacy. It costs a lot of money to do this. Currently we have 3 positions that are focused on searching for video and doing the redaction on these videos, with 2 more coming out, right? So that's a total of 5 positions, and there might be more as well in the future. People are still getting used to the idea of body-worn video being out there and requesting it. So I'm going to shift a little bit. One of the organizers of the conference wanted me to talk a little bit about the architecture and the technology behind it. This is our in-car video, and this is a super simple, basic my attempt at the architecture here. So this is our in-car or dash cameras. Basically, the camera's in the car. It gets uploaded to a local server. It gets stored there, and it's pretty easy to access internally in our department. But anytime you you go beyond the network, our city prosecutors are a separate network, county prosecutors, defense attorneys, courts. Anytime we go beyond our own network, we burn physical media, we burn a DVD. We burn thousands of DVDs. We have huge machines that churn out DVDs for prosecutors and for the public as well. So it works well internally to some extent, but not so good once we share outside of SPD. So here's my old man yelling at the cloud. So we went with the cloud, right? And I will. Sometimes this is me, right, yelling at the cloud because the cloud's not perfect. There are technology drawbacks about the cloud in terms of you're relying on your network and your internet. But essentially what this is doing is the officer has a body-worn camera. With a cell phone, they put in some basic information so we can find it on the case number. We upload it via docking station in a precinct. It goes into the cloud, right, to our vendor. And from there, we can give permissions for people to view the video, including our prosecutors and the public defenders and the public if they want it. Some public still want DVDs, right? And so we burn physical media. The courts are still using DVDs. The courts are not quite there yet, and the vendors aren't either. But as you can see, this just makes it easier to share. And for us, it makes sense because we share so many videos, we release so many videos to the public, and you can just do it via link, right? Or with the prosecutors, we just share a video with them and they log on. And it's just the internet. As long as they have the internet, they can access this stuff. I'm not saying this is correct for everybody, but it works for us given our needs. I was also asked to talk a little bit about budget. Our project budget was about $2.4 million, including $600,000 for a federal grant. We're significantly under budget for that $2.4 million, which is good news, but it's still a fair amount of money. And then our ongoing budget is about $2.2 million, and part of this is the storage for our vendor and the software and warranties and such. And then that's about $1 million, and the 1.2 is just staffing and operations, right? The 5 positions that I talked about, and additional positions to support the technology and the hardware. I should add also in this project budget, there's a lot of infrastructure needs, right? Because you're sending video through your network. We had to upgrade our network. We had to do physical infrastructure at our precincts. You have to put in electrical wiring and network wiring in order for to put in the docks that the officers put the cameras into at the end of their shift. It also includes community engagement. We do a fair amount of community engagement, and we have resources there as well. So is it worth it? How much do these companies spend on regaining the public trust, right? These are some companies that have had some issues with public trust recently. I hesitate a little bit to compare law enforcement to a private corporation because it's, shareholder value is different than public safety. Public safety is much more paramount. But at the same time, these companies to spend a lot of money. I don't know, I'm not privy to that information, but my guess is they spend a lot of money trying to regain that public trust. From my view, we're looking at under 1% of our budget for annually for these cameras. I mean, to me, given the environment in Seattle, over the past 8 years, I would argue that it's worth it, and that it hopefully will continue to increase the public trust. This isn't to say that it's worth it for every jurisdiction. I don't know if it's worth it for an Indianapolis. I mean, I think it's the cost benefit question is to you and to the chief and the command staff there. Is it worth that? It's a lot of money, and that money could be spent on housing services, transportation, whatever's in your general fund budget, how much is that worth to you? Is it better spent on other things? I mean, I think that's a question for you. For us, I think it was money well spent and is going to be. Finally, this is our website, and you can pull up the policy. We have a FAQ that's pretty extensive. We have translated materials as well. So if you want some information on how we did things in Seattle and continue to do things, this is a good place for it. But again, just because it works for us does not mean it works for you or will work for you. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. And I think to clarify what Nick meant about what he was asked to speak about, we had you all, when you registered, the opportunity to submit questions for us about what your thoughts were about body-worn cameras. And a lot of people ask questions about policy, ask questions about the architecture. Apparently we have some very sharp technical folks in our community that wanted to hear answers to some of these things, and so certainly in budget-wise, so we asked our speakers to kind of give us some insights on their perspective on those things to answer some of those questions. With that, I will introduce Ms. Kristen Cosgrove from Cincinnati Police Department to give some thoughts from Cincinnati.
Hi, I'm the Special Projects Coordinator for Cincinnati. I actually came into this role following our body camera program. So this was not my job beforehand. It is now. So that kind of gives you a little bit of background of how big of a project this was for the police department. I'm going to talk a little bit about our process, this whole project from beginning to end, what implementation took, what some of the financing involved was, how many different members of our city of Cincinnati were involved in this process. It was actually a very lengthy process, very in-depth. What some of us have learned over going to conferences and meeting with some other grant recipients is that some of their projects had actually failed almost immediately because of failure to consider the cost, the upfront cost, the maintenance cost to have a sustainable program like this. So some of them actually put the cameras out, the officers went out, and then there was no back-end consideration or management. So that was really something that we learned along the way, that really taking a good look at this, the planning process, you can never stress that planning process enough in a project like this. The Cincinnati Police Department has just under 1,050 sworn police officers. So what happened was in 2010 and then following in 2014, the Cincinnati Police Department began testing body cameras. They were in their very early phases. Some of the assessments at that time was that our network was not ready to take on the data that was required to upload and all the recording, the resolution, all of these things, and then the storage considerations. We didn't have enough local storage. It would have taken a very large build out at that time. And again, the network basically would have shut our city down. So again, we went back in 2014, tested the cameras again, really saw a lot of progress in the technology. We were very pleased with it, saw the future of what the body cameras really could do for our agencies, and we saw it as a very promising program. In 2015, our plan was accelerated. In the city of Cincinnati, there was an officer-involved shooting. It was not our agency, but it was the University of Cincinnati Police Department, which is within the city limits. So that spurred the city of Cincinnati, through its council, mayor, city manager, to say, we need this body camera program now. Again, and this is what everybody's been seeing nationwide, this plea for transparency. That officer was wearing a body camera. They saw it as very important that we also outfit our police officers. But it wasn't that easy. It wasn't that easy to hang a body camera on every police officer in our agency. So in August of 2015, following that, council went ahead, said, we want the police department to purchase the body cameras for the police officers. So we started in our planning process. And this planning process actually involved almost 40 city employees. And their departments, they were employed in anywhere from human resources, purchasing, our city IT, police IT, finance, the city manager's office. The list goes on and on. Almost every department except for maybe water and sewer was involved in our planning process. So we also had to involve facilities because they had to set up our infrastructure. We did have to dedicate specific fiber to the uploads of all the data that we knew we were about to go into. So this planning actually had 5 subcommittees that went off and studied each of these areas that we thought this would touch and had questions that needed to be answered. One of them was officer buy-in, officer attitudes about body cameras. Now, Sergeant Smith tested the body cameras in 2014. There was a little resistance. So kind of what we would ask everybody is say, okay, do you want us to put a camera on you and record everything you do all day long? Nobody really said yes. So we understood that they were a little concerned and a little hesitant about this process. Anybody would be. So another concern that they did have was that the way this was going to be used by management. Are we going to overmanage them? Are we going to watch their video and try to find anything that they're doing wrong? Number one, we had to tell them, we don't have enough time in the day to watch all of your video and see if you're wearing your hat or not. So that was a big piece of this, and we wanted them to embrace the program. We really did, because that's a very important piece of these technological advances in a department such as ours, because honestly, if you think about it, we are still running a time book in paper form. So sometimes, somebody said along the lines that, there's 2 things that officers don't like. They don't like change and they don't like things to stay the same. So we were kind of, going up against that. That always stuck with me because I was like, you're so right. So we really wanted them engaged in this process, and that involved also our Fraternal Order of Police, because for them to have participation and input on developing our procedures, it was invaluable. It was invaluable. And they will bring things to the table that we hadn't thought of. So another piece of these subcommittees that we discovered very quickly, not only the data networking requirements that we were going to have to upgrade in the city networks, something that became apparent to us, and we've touched on this, was a lot of the Public Records Act. So we had seen Seattle at the time, and when we were really considering implementing, they were going through their YouTube process. So we saw that, panicked, and really started to look at these things. But then again, very early on, as you peel this onion back, we kept finding other issues that we had to address. So Sergeant Smith and I were in a meeting, and we had this aha moment with the prosecutor's office. And I am a former prosecutor. I did come from that. I was actually a public defender as well. So I had done that in law school, moved on to the prosecutor's office. So Sergeant Smith and I were in a meeting, and we realized how much the criminal court process was going to affect this video. Who was going to be the major consumer, the highest consumer of this video? It's defense attorneys and prosecutors and other attorneys. So our stats show that 92% of our video is requested through the courts by defense attorneys, by prosecutors for the prosecution of the cases. So very early on, this was one of our bigger focuses. There were so many focuses. So what we did, and knowing that a lot of this video was going to have to be redacted. We then went to our law department and said, okay, what are our requirements for redaction here? Because again, as we go through this, there is this balance between transparency and personal privacy. We don't want to put anything out there that is legally protected, that is exempt from disclosure. So we knew what the Public Records Act required. We did not know what this discovery process required, what the criminal courts required, these sorts of things. When we turn over this video to an attorney, what's our obligation? What is our obligation for privacy and to protect and redact? And the answer was, we don't really know. We don't really know what you should do. So we start from, scratch on a lot of this. And as everybody has said and alluded to, when we started this program, there's not a lot out there. There's not a lot to rely on. So we really were navigating these waters. They were unnavigated in a lot of things that we saw. So we really had to put together the minds of all these 40 people and different disciplines to formulate our own program. That doesn't always happen. There's usually something you can go off of. So we really found ourselves in a position that we had to do a lot of this work ourselves. So we did the best we could. We think we think we did pretty well. We had a very talented team. It was some of the brightest minds that we could put on it. Very hard work. So we did go through this process. This whole process from planning to deployment, it took almost exactly a year. So looking back on that, I was actually impressed that we did it in a year. So we had a lot of community engagement, a lot of sessions. We talked to a lot of people. Everybody who was a stakeholder, they were invited to give us their thoughts, the officers, the city, everybody. So the media. The media was an important one as well because we didn't know how they were going to react. It really was underwhelming when we did deploy because we had done so much outreach. There weren't that many questions about what we were going to do or how we were going to handle things anymore. There's been a lot of talk about the procedures. Formulating the procedures was a very arduous task. And we assessed almost every bit of that procedure. We talked about how it would impact the officers, how it would impact investigations, how it would impact the attorneys, how it would impact everybody involved. So it was really a thoughtful process, and we really are pleased with how our procedure is written. And again, the FOP was very accepting of it. They had some comments. They had some meetings with our command staff, and for the most part, they were accepting of what we had come up with. Now, to touch on a topic that had happened earlier, our officers have very little discretion to turn on and off for the cameras. The cameras do not stay on all day long. They can't. The batteries won't last. So that was a primary concern we had. But there are very explicit times when they are to turn the camera on to record and when they can turn it off. There's not much gray area there. So there's a lot of discussion about that. As far as private residences go, in our discussions about the procedures, we kept going back to all of this technology. We keep putting so much on these officers to have to remember. They have to follow this, they have to follow that, they have to do this again. So we didn't, again, want them to have to determine, should I turn it on or off? Should I do these things? We wanted as little question as possible. And then we also thought there would be fewer mistakes that way as well, fewer forget moments. And Ohio is a one-party consent state, so anybody being recorded, it was not necessary to gain their consent. So from a privacy standpoint, we felt very confident that we were within our rights. Entering a private residence, as long as they had the legal right to be there, they were to continue recording. And that was primarily, we want to protect them. We want to protect that officer. We want to protect those people in the residence. So those are the determinations that were made based on those. As far as kind of early observations of our program, what we've seen, have we seen any effects? We were not able to have a controlled study that would show side by side officers that were not wearing body cameras and the officers that were. We were in this too fast, and we had to get this accomplished. So unfortunately, we couldn't go through that. We did have some luxury of planning and time, but we did not have that much luxury. So the only thing that we can really do is now make an annual comparison, a look back. So we've only had about 1 full year of full deployment. So we are going to now take a look at that, see if we can draw any conclusions, but nothing's going to be anything that we can really point to. Well, it was body cameras. So criminal trials, the prosecutors have noted there's no real change. There's no real change. There's not more guilty pleas. What you'll see on most of these videos is that the officers aren't capturing the actual crime, unless you're going to say a falsification and the person gives you the wrong name, wrong date of birth. That's really, one of the only things you're going to catch actually in progress that would say, oh, there's no way you can fight this. So the prosecutors aren't really seeing much change. We didn't know what to expect, but that's the report. What we are seeing is the impact of the investigations on citizen complaints. We are tracking anything that's been exonerated based on body camera footage. That's where we're seeing some change. That's where we're noting some differences. We are seeing a lot more and a lot less time spent investigating citizen complaints, both at the district level and our internal investigations level. So we are tracking that. We are seeing that, again, a process like this, it does involve a lot of resource. It does involve a lot of officer time, testimony. Citizens come in. The officers have to come in and say, one person says this, one person says that. There's no real way to say what happened. Now it's mostly recorded. Those incidents are recorded. So that's really the impact that we've seen from the program. And just to go back to our deployment, we deployed in 2 phases. We deployed 650 cameras in a phased approach. That was our phase 1. We started from the smallest district to the largest to kind of phase in everything that was going to happen. And as we deployed it, again, we got bigger and bigger and bigger. That was a decision also because we had to hire a records redaction team, a video redaction team, and we really had to get them trained, ease them into this process before they were just inundated with this video. Now that's really been, the back end of this has been what's really overwhelming and amazing, is all this video that needs to be produced. I talked about the court system, the criminal courts, and how much they consume. Again, 8% is media, 92% is the criminal court process. So we hired 5 civilians for body camera redaction. There's a supervisor, there's 2 sworn officers that are also a part of this unit, and that was at a price tag of approximately $850,000 a year, not including the sworn officers because they were absorbed, they were already in our budget. Also, the law department hired 2 paralegals. I don't have the numbers on them, but that really wasn't our budget impact. We entered into, after an RFP process, we went through a testing phase. We entered into a 7-year master services agreement. That price tag came in a little less than $6 million for the whole price of the contract, for the length of the contract. So personnel costs on top of an annual cost were about at 1.6, a little more per year, what we pay for the program. Now again, we had the political will. There was definitely the political will. They did a combination of capital funding, general funding, grant funding. We also received a grant from the Bureau of Justice Assistance and some bond sales. So that got us through a couple of years, and we continue to realize that this program has to be maintained. We've seen so many agencies that just weren't able to sustain it from a cost perspective. So our biggest cost is that back end, the redacting, everything that has to go through with producing this video. So we continue to try to tweak it. We're always assessing it. We are really trying our hardest not to hire additional staff, but right now, for example, our redaction team has to work 5 hours of overtime a week to keep up with the demand of the video to be produced. So just to give you an idea of what type of resources are necessary for this type of program. And not everybody is able to do that, but again, where we came into the project and the time frame and the political will at that time was why we were able to do that. So, I think
Thank you very much, Kristen. Before we move to the Q&A session, I wanted to point out a couple of other special people here that participated today. So part of this, the CICF grant was not only to bring these people in to share their insights with everyone in this room, but the people from Cincinnati and the people from Seattle have been here all day today, from first thing this morning up until coming here this evening, meeting with IMPD, meeting with local people to share their experiences and to be a resource for them to move this forward. And for that, I'd like to point out Mr. Ron Campbell, Sergeant Campbell from Seattle PD, Sergeant Ryan Smith from Cincinnati PD, and Assistant Chief Terry Thiegy from Cincinnati as well. And thank you. And I have to give a shout out to Sergeant Kendall Adams here up front, who helped me kind of put this all together. Him and I had a lot of quality phone time. Thank you, sir. So hopefully, again, a number of the questions that we saw were submitted were definitely touched upon here. If the answers weren't as detailed as you'd like, or you have things that weren't touched upon, now would be a great time to have you ask those questions. And what we'll do is we'll raise your hand and we can float a microphone your way, and we can take those questions. Yes, sir, over here.
Tell us the relative size and the number of officers of the three departments, Indianapolis, Cincinnati, and Seattle.
We'll start down here with the chief and work.
So currently, we have 1,615 officers, about 200 civilian employees. At the end of this year, we'll have, if all goes well, 1,712 police officers. End of next year, the goal is 1,743.
We're very similar in size to Indianapolis. We have, with cameras, about 950 officers wearing the cameras, but total sworn, Sergeant Campbell, I think it's about 1,600 or so. Yeah, 1,600.
Cincinnati currently has 1,047 sworn officers. Does that include our recruits? It does not. Okay, we do have a current recruit class that's scheduled to graduate in June. And then we also have 252 civilian employees.
All right, now somewhere. Okay, right here, ma'am.
My name is Brooke Smith. I work at Keffer Barnhart, a law firm downtown. We do civil rights litigation and criminal defense. And one of the issues we've seen with Indiana departments that have cameras are officers with the discretion to turn them on and off. And we see it a lot with audio. They'll turn on the audio or turn off the audio at different sections. And so could you just be a bit more specific about the policies that you have with respect to turning on and off the audio for the officers?
I've been with Seattle PD all day, so I kind of know what their policies are often very similar to ours. The cameras actually have a function that you can allow the cameras to be muted by the operator, or you can disallow that. We do not allow the officers to mute or do anything. They just don't have that capability. I don't want to speak.
Yeah, no, it's the same with us as well. I should add that our in-car video system, the officers also wear, or dash cams, officers also wear an additional microphone. And even when I was talking about a resident can direct an officer to turn off the camera before they enter into their private residence, even then the audio microphone remains on, and that's per state law or wrapped up in state law.
I know that Cincinnati has a 90-day retention period. What's the policy for Seattle?
So we actually retain videos for quite a long time. Currently, we are at a minimum of 3.5 years for the videos, and this isn't per state law, but per internal policy decision as well as, which was formulated from our legal department, but also our Office of Professional Accountability. So it ranges from at the low end 3.5 years, and I'd say in the majority, depends on the type of crime. Some of this is per state law. For example, homicide, an unsolved homicide will keep in perpetuity.
I'll follow up on that one just from Cincinnati's perspective. 90 days is generally the bottom line if we don't need it for anything else. We have other homicides that are kept indefinitely, those types of things, so we have to have that approved by the state. And 90 days is also consistent with our MVR policy. So we wanted to keep those both consistent, that 91 days, and that video has fallen off, and that's actually what everybody in the legal community has been used to as well. So I just wanted to follow up with that.
So I think it was either last year or 2016, Indiana moved it to 190 days, so anything that we captured would be 190 days. And again, we would be in the same boat. If it's evidentiary, we'd have to keep it longer, cases like homicide forever. I think the difficulty, and if I can ask a question, I think the difficulty would be trying to identify those videos that may generate a complaint, if that makes sense, where there may be some civil litigation, and how do you handle that?
So I think one of the primary driving factors behind the retention policy is around civil litigation and the statutes of limitations for that. And one of the reasons I wouldn't, from personally as a program manager, I think we keep the videos too long. It's from both the department perspective in terms of retaining and you have more video to get through, but also from the public perspective. These videos include a lot of images of the public, and so I think the less you want to find that sweet spot. You don't want videos hanging around forever, but as what happens with a lot of things, I think our attorneys are driving a lot of that retention policy.
And then that is an interesting point too, because a lot of challenges on some of this video is that the concern is that you'll use these as facial recognition pools. So that's one of the procedural considerations that several civil liberties groups have brought up. What do you do with this video once it's stored? So that has also been something that we considered within our procedures. Now, identifying something that could ultimately end up in a complaint, we have given the officers the authority to speak with their supervisor, like, look, I don't know what it is about this situation, but it's not sitting well with me. I think it could generate a complaint. This person was not happy with the service, anything like that. They are allowed to, through their supervisor, then hold that video longer in a situation like that. But that's really the only option we have. And then throughout our research, identifying best practices with regard to retention policies, we did see the norm is really, nationwide going to be about 90 days to a year. That's kind of what we saw the average nationwide to be. Again, there's not a lot out there. There weren't a lot of policies out there, but that was our experience.
On the news, I think it was Plainfield, they're trying body armor videos. And if I'm not mistaken, it says that the video activates when the officer pulls his gun. Is that the same type of thing?
We don't have that right now. That is definitely, technology is moving that way. Cincinnati does not have that. We're considering testing that. There are a lot of triggers that some of the manufacturers are coming up with. For example, they can, connect activation to the cruiser. So if the lights go on, if a door opens, all these kinds of triggers that really where we're seeing it go is you can turn these on and off. So you can almost configure your own triggers. But right now, that is actually a product that we have heard about, that if the officer unholsters their gun, that the body camera would automatically start recording. Right now, it is manual recording that they need to press on their actual equipment to begin recording in accordance with policy. So I know there's also technology out there that they are looking into that when you get into a certain range of another recording camera, that would also trigger the cameras in that distance, in that area. So those are just some of the things that we're aware of, but none of them are we using yet. We're still on manual activation.
Yeah, and exactly the same with Seattle as well.
Yes, sir. Okay, I had sort of three questions that are related. One would be for the Indianapolis Police Chief in terms of training budget for the sort of list of triggering events that the Seattle representative listed for when the body camera should be turned on, no discretion. And then the other related question would be for perhaps a Seattle or Cincinnati representatives regarding how you deal with the issue of redaction of privacy. In other words, what sort of redaction policies do you share, or is there a consensus between the two departments on how they initiate the protection of the third parties in these videos?
So I think the question of me is what I think we would do, whether it would be an automatic trigger or the officer turn it on. Is that?
I was more
is
interested
it?
in whether or not there's an actual training program now for the list of triggering events and how much it costs. In other words, are you spending $2 million a year now to train the current police force on these types of stops? And I have some other background information on it, but I was just curious.
So still not sure that I understand your question. So we don't have a body-worn camera program now. Are you asking?
If we use the list of triggering events that the Seattle representative listed in that one slide,
Right.
for when the camera has to be on, I guess I'm curious, partly because I've heard from other representatives from the ACLU on the training they provide to the department, as to how you build in proactivity in the police officers now. So how much training, do you have a training program that includes those various details?
Yeah. So I couldn't see the slide. So probably, but so our academy is about all together with the academy and the FTO program. Our officers spend about 47 weeks in some form of training, and then they have a year of kind of on duties, probationary year, where they're viewed by supervisors and a monthly report is done. So I'm not sure I answered your question, but
How much does that cost roughly? And the other question would be, and I may not be asking it clearly enough, but the idea is how much continuing education is built in to sort of reducing those trigger points,
like de-escalation training, mental health training, CIT training.
violence.
Okay, sure. Yeah, that's so. Yeah, I think there's the state of Indiana. You have to have 24 hours of incumbent training. So we bring all 1,600 officers in and do 24 hours of training. Last year we did 36 hours. The state mandates certain things, whether it's use of force, whether it's mental health training, whether it's driver's training. So all those things is mandated by the state, and then we internally look at things that we're struggling with, or things that we've noticed patterns. And then we try to add that additional training. So our officers go out to the range twice a year. Our range has changed a little bit. It's just not about firing. It's that whole use of force concept. It's they get de-escalation training. All of our officers just last year, 80% of those officers went through mental health first aid, so it's determining behavior and mental health issues, making that determination in the rest of this year, the rest of the 20%, we'll get that done. We did some fair and impartial policing, implicit bias training last year, where we had both community members and command level staff sit and go through the training. We had 30 of our own officers trained in implicit bias training so that they could teach it. This is probably the first time publicly I've said that, but I've backed away from that because that's policemen teaching policemen. And I don't know how well you teach implicit bias when you have a policeman teaching policemen. So we're trying to figure out how do you do that rather than me just saying we checked the box and we had it. How do we really engage and have the community in there so that the officers do understand different opinions and different viewpoints, and that the citizens see the viewpoint of the officer too. Long-winded answer, but we're doing those things.
And on that training piece, I should add that in terms of Seattle, there's an initial 4-hour training that goes through, goes through the policy and when to turn it on and when to turn it off. But we're also developing, and I know Cincinnati can talk about it a little bit, about cameras for the training specifically, the training unit specifically, and so it becomes a standard part of the equipment while they are training. So if they're training on at the range on something, and perhaps it's a part of scenario-based training, they turn it on, and so they develop that muscle memory. So are you a two-party state? We are a two-party state. However, the Attorney General of our state has issued an opinion saying that police work, when officers interact with the public, that they do not have an expectation of privacy, and so we notify them, but we do not need consent, except going into a private residence, unless there's criminal activity occurring in there. But to get to your question about redaction and standards and when we redact, it is totally dependent on state law. We literally have thousands of review thousands of videos per month from our in-car systems and from our body camera systems. And the public disclosure experts and paralegals have a long list of what needs to be redacted, what needs to be protected in terms of privacy, and what doesn't, and offensiveness to the public. There are times when we might push the envelope a little bit, and we get sued regularly. Sometimes we win, sometimes we don't. But we do push the envelope in terms of privacy, especially around victims and witnesses, and trying to maintain that level of privacy. And we've had a lot of the community is concerns about privacy, and the police department does as well. And I think there's an interesting area of congruence between the police department and privacy advocates that don't always get along. And we're both in a meeting saying, yeah, we agree on this. We don't want. There's some things that should be private and not out in the public sphere. So, but it's totally up to state law.
Good evening.
And that's the same for Cincinnati. We developed a redaction matrix for every kind of scenario. So you have a public records request, what needs to be redacted. You have a criminal trial from a defense attorney, what has to be redacted for discovery. And then in Ohio, you are required to cite the legal justification for the redaction, so then that's also contained in the matrix. What we cite is not only the Public Records Act, federal privacy laws, all these types of things that we have developed over time in order to protect, the citizen's private interest.
Good evening. Mr. Zakowski, you spoke much about the issues of car cameras versus body cameras, and we're obviously having this discussion to see whether or not there's benefit, I'll bet cost and everything else, and social benefit as well. I guess the questions that are arising now with me are, what prompted the actual creation of the body camera, and are other types of media cameras admissible? Maybe the lady from Cincinnati can answer that, such as a personal camera. I mean, everybody's got a camera now, and oftentimes, sometimes events will be publicized through YouTube before the police officers release their particular video. And where in the future are these issues of use of the body camera going?
So in terms of what precipitated the body cameras in Seattle, since Seattle was under a consent agreement, actually, we were just found in compliance. We have some reporting to do, but the federal judge signed off on it. We're in full and complete compliance. But the body cameras were not part of the consent agreement. However, the monitoring team that's appointed by the judge that implemented the consent agreement, the things laid out in the consent agreement, was a very strong proponent of body cameras. The federal judge, very strong proponent of body cameras. The chief at the time, who's since moved on, Chief Kathleen O'Toole, very strong proponent of body cameras, and the several mayors that we've had through that process have been a proponent. And it's always been, you know, the public not having access to images in that officer-public interaction, where the body camera would provide that. You know, I think I've been with the department for about 2 years. I remember after, probably a year or two after the John T. Williams shooting that I mentioned that kind of precipitated the consent agreement, I was walking to work one morning, and there was a woman in crisis in the downtown core area, a woman in crisis, and two squad cars that were responding, and literally about 5 or 6 people out with their cell phone cameras recording, and that struck me. I mean, you know, obviously there was a lack of trust in the police department. You know, why else would you have you know, a handful of people recording this incident? And so I think you know, that precipitated it. And also, to follow up with your question, those videos are admissible. I believe. I mean, it's a piece. It becomes a piece of evidence. A private citizen recording the incident, and you know, when we go to our community meetings, we tell people you can record the police, right? As long as you're not interfering with their work, you can record, and they cannot tell you not to record. So that's treated in terms of evidence, and again, I'm not an attorney. Kristen could probably talk more about this, but it's treated the same way as a piece of body-worn video.
It's definitely admissible. It just has to follow some evidentiary procedures to allow it to be admissible. For example, somebody couldn't pull the video off of Facebook and then use it in court. The person who recorded it was there, said, yes, I recorded it. That has to be established for it to be admissible. But we do use surveillance cameras, all those kinds of things.
Thank you. I have a question for Chief Roach. Quickly, you said that there were how many officers in Indianapolis?
1,612 right now.
Would all of those wear the body cam? Or?
We have about between 900 and 1,000 that we would need to equip with cameras initially.
Okay. And
guys and gals wearing the blue uniform that are actually out taking runs.
Okay. And I wondered how much your communities charge private citizens who request video?
Yeah, great question. So if you are involved in the incident, if you are a victim, a witness, or suspect, you can get that video for just a small copy charge, which is around $1. However, the state legislature, specifically for body-worn video in Washington State, recently passed a law that said if you were not involved in the incident and you would like a copy of that video, then we can charge you the costs for redacting if that's being done to the video. And we did a study, we charge about $6 per minute per redacted piece in a video. So if there's, you know, a 10-minute video and there's 2 individuals that need to be redacted, you know, you're looking at $120. And the reason why that is because we have some what we call frequent requesters, and it's that the New York Times Magazine article draws it out very well. Since we're so open in terms of public records, we've had several individuals who said, give me every video that you have. And that is a challenge because we need to protect people's privacy, and redacting that amount of video I think we did the math one time, it would, you know, with 10 people, it would take, you know, decades. There is no, again, basically no charge, very little charge if you're involved in the incident. It's only when, if you're a media member or a neighbor, you're interested in to see what happened in that incident, then we, if there is redaction, then we would charge you a slight, the fee for the redaction.
Thank you.
That's a really good question. In Ohio, we don't get to charge. We could maybe make up some of our $850,000 for personnel costs, but no, the Ohio legislation currently has not changed since the introduction of this technology. So there's a few bills pending. One is probably going to make it as far as any other we've seen, but we're still relying on the old Public Records Act, which Ohio is also a very open sunshine state as far as public records go, that they treat any public records as owned by the citizens. So basically, the way they interpret it is that any public document or record or video is owned by the citizenry. So for us to go back and then charge the citizens for their own records, that's kind of how they look at it. That's been brought up quite a bit just because of the cost that we've incurred in this program. And as far as we can see, they're probably not going to change their minds on that as much as we would like them to, but that's a really good question. And that does vary state by state. Yes, we have. We have. Ours are a little bit different from Washington's because our requesters are at least required to narrowly tailor their request. They cannot be overbroad. So what happens in that kind of instance is we'll contact our law department, say this is why we believe it's not narrowly tailored for the request, and then they'll kind of take it from there and apply, you know, any of the case law that they can to turn back around. And what you're required to do is then tell that requester, you need to, this is not how our records are kept, or here's how they are kept, and assist them in then narrowly defining what it is they're looking for.
Dr. Lum, more of a comment than a question. Maybe you can elaborate. I was particularly impressed with your statement about there must be something amiss when both the public and the police are looking for two body-worn cameras to protect them from each other. And I think that's true. And in light of most of the studies that you referenced, it doesn't seem that the studies, well, it seems like the studies prove this out, your statement out, in that body-worn cameras aren't a panacea. They're not going to solve all of our problems. So can you comment a little bit more on that of, you know, what more do we need to do? We probably need to do body-worn cameras just because of the public pressure and the feeling amongst some of us in the public that they are going to help. But I think most of us realize they're not a panacea and they're not going to solve all of our problems.
I thought I would get the easiest question that was just a quick answer. That's a very, very long answer that I could provide for you on this one. But let me give just a couple of short points. One is that people often look towards technology and other things to be the panacea for policing or police community relations. And I'm not just talking about the police, I'm also talking about citizens, and body-worn cameras is a good example of this. But over and over, we know that the core issues within the police organization and also within the relationships between the police and the public are not easily resolved by some kind of quick technology. It's just like humans more generally. We can't resolve our communication and our kindness or our interactions with each other because we have cell phones now or because we use email, you know. So that's a broader social issue. But to get at your second question about policing, I mean, I was a police officer and a detective about 20 years ago, and in Baltimore City, and in those days the fanciest technology you had was a pager, and that was it. And also I think there was less of a kind of an opening of the police to realize just how complex their jobs are. And now they're starting to treat their jobs as very complex and difficult. Policing is a very difficult profession. I don't say this in defense or not in defense of the police. I mean that it is a very difficult profession, especially in advanced democracies, and it's difficult for people to have good interactions with the police that are high quality and et cetera, et cetera. There's so many responsibilities in democracy that we have with our policing, both from citizens and from the police themselves. So there are so many aspects of police organizations that need reinvention. I only mentioned one of them, this idea of mentorship. I don't know if you all remembered, I talked a little bit about mentorship between first-line supervisors and officers. Imagine that and then multiply it by 1,000. That's the different types of things that police are considering right now in terms of reinventing themselves. When I was a police officer, you never saw your supervisor. You saw them to turn in your report, and that was it. You never saw your major in your district, except Christmas, and if somebody was like in serious trouble or something like that, you saw your major. That's not policing. That's not policing anymore, and it shouldn't have been then. But there's a lot more interaction now between police supervisors and their officers, or there should be. And that mentorship is the seed in which accountability structures grow. So you can all imagine, that's like one little teeny aspect of policing that I'm talking about. Again, multiply that by 1,000 in training. Let me just bring up other things. Training. Officers go through 6 months of academy, 9 months of field training, another 3 months maybe of probationary period. How does that training actually lead to actual actions on the street? What's the connection between those two things? Often not. Sometimes a lot of the training gets undone in field training, it gets undone in the street. And we have to talk about that as well, right? Do we want that to be undone? Why is it becoming undone? What are the officers then doing every day, and how are they improving safety, their relationship with people, their relationship with each other as professionals, right? We have a serious problem in this country of disparity. This is a big issue that we still have not been, I'm talking about racial disparity, that we still have yet to overcome in policing. There's a lot of hurt there, I think, that, and historic hurt that we have to get over first before then figuring out, okay, how do we then figure out how to create more fairness in traffic stops? I mean, that's such a specific question, right? So it's so hard for me to answer your question because it's like a whole 1 year of lecturing just on this issue. I would say, I believe that this is, some police officers have talked to me and said, Cynthia, this is like the hardest time for police. I disagree with them. I think this is the golden age in American policing because I feel like we're in a situation where there's great levels of discourse. People are beginning to have open conversations about things like disparity, about things like mental illness in the police department and outside the police department. People are having these types of conversations, and it leads to an opening that allows us to rethink how we want policing to be. It doesn't have to be the way it's always been. It certainly doesn't have to be the way it was when I was the cop in Baltimore. And I've also evolved in my own thinking, you know, as not a police now, in terms of what I think are the responsibilities of police, and also people and their relationship with the police. So, I'm sorry, that's just it's a very long-winded way to say it is complicated. It is heck of a complicated profession, and we need to start treating it as such. And I would argue, let's, if we're going to increase officer salary because we think it's a complicated profession, then they also have to come to an understanding about how complex their profession is, and they've got to rise to that level. Jeremy, I don't know. This is a hard one. Never give a mic to an academic.
It's complex.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, my question was for Cincinnati and Seattle. You mentioned that the officers were a little bit apprehensive over the idea of being kind of spied upon or looked upon. Are there still like policies or procedures in place where if someone in the redaction team sees something that may not live up to the values of your departments, that they can escalate that in such a way where they feel empowered to do so?
That's a really good question, because there are officers on our redaction team that do see things and they know those policies and procedures very well, and they can't look the other way sometimes. If they do see an infraction, they do have to escalate that. That's been our policy. I don't know that that's actually included in our procedure. I believe that's an SOP for the redaction team. But on the flip side of that, they also see good police work, and they escalate that as well. So we can put that out there through our PIO. To say, you know, they saw somebody going above and beyond. They saw somebody being, you know, very kind in a situation that, you know, or they're de-escalating, that they really went above and beyond. So it does go with both sides of the coins, and we've really tried to focus on that, because we don't want it to be this, aha, gotcha, we found this. They really are truthfully happening upon things, and they do have a duty to go ahead and report something that they've seen that's a violation of procedure. But again, we try to even that out with the good behavior as well. Now, I will tell you about only 5% is reviewed. 5% of all the video is reviewed by our video redaction team. So you can consider 95% out there is not really seeing the light of day because it hasn't been requested. Bottom line. And early on, I think I did say that there is no way anybody has the time in the world to review all of this footage or anything like that. So, and that was also communicated to them. There is no chance we can review all this video to just see what's going on. But unfortunately, if there is a bad act and somebody happens upon it, or sometimes, you know, our inspections will get to it, that'll go that way too. But we really do have a lot of good officers out there doing good things as well that they're being recognized for.
Yeah, I would echo those comments as well. I mean, and especially the fact that there's so much video. Really, I think artificial intelligence and sentiment analysis to being able to determine when there's escalated language in escalating language or de-escalating language in an incident can be helpful for this. But you know, I know there are community concerns around artificial intelligence for the videos as well. So I mean, that's something that's probably a discussion we'll have with community members in the future. But the same, if you know, people reviewing these videos in the public disclosure unit, if they see something, they're obligated to notify someone. I kind of want to add a little bit about the comment about, and Dr. Lim, I think you made it that you know, there's that we're recording that we're recording police shows that there's something wrong in society. I think that's true to some degree, but also I think it's just expected. And I'm not a millennial by any means, but you know, I'm kind of hip with the kids a little bit. But I mean, really, I think, you know, there are people who, I think there's an expectation that there's just a general expectation among younger people that stuff is being recorded as kind of pictures or it didn't happen, right? And I mean, you know, people are filming themselves playing video games and other people watch it, and you know, I just think it's kind of become the normal. You can argue that might be a sickness in society, but I think it is just kind of an expectation now, and I'm not entirely comfortable with it, but I know a lot of people are. The younger officers, they don't even think twice. They just do it. It's like, oh yeah, camera. And when they interact with young people on the street, you know, you're being audio and video recorded. Don't even skip a beat, right? It's like, oh, you mean you weren't audio and video recording before when we tell people that we've implemented body cameras? So I think there's an expectation that there's a record somewhere, and that there's something that can clear up you know, confusion, or you know, bring some you know, black and white to something that's gray. And you know, again, you can argue that that's a sickness, but I think it's just kind of the society that we're in now.
I think we have time. One final question.
One final question.
Yeah, much has been said here about the cost of implementing a body camera program. And I was wondering, since implementing your programs, have you found any ways to cut costs or any ways to save? And then the other is, I think for Cincinnati, you said that the public defender and the prosecutor are your primary consumers. Have you thought about any cost-sharing measures or transferring some funds from those two budgets into the police officer budget?
Well, we would love to do that. The Public Defender's Office is a separate agency, and then also there are private defense attorneys that are involved in this process, so they aren't affiliated with the government. And what we've seen in our region are very serious shrinking municipal budgets, local government budgets. We did experience in the last few years, the state used to provide local government funding, and they have sliced and just cut back on that. So governments have been forced to find other ways to find revenue, making cuts. The Public Defender's Office is a county agency, and they have experienced very serious deficits as well. So it's kind of doing a cost sharing. We could potentially maybe look into some grants on some shared government services, things like that. That's really the only potential for that sharing, because we're a separate agency. In no way would they probably be receptive to spending more money on something that they feel is the city's responsibility. I'm sorry, what was the first part of your question as to that?
Since implementing the program, have you found any
Cost sharing, okay, right. That's another good question too, because when we implemented this program, we knew that nobody was ever going to be able to walk away from body cameras. You couldn't implement the program and be done in, just wipe your hands clean and walk away. This is always something that is going to have to be maintained, managed, tweaked, constantly revisited. Just for example, I think we are on potentially our third revision to our procedures. Also, something that we constantly are managing and reviewing is that back end redaction piece, that redaction unit. So again, we just had meetings this week with our law department regarding how much has to be redacted. Do we have to continue redacting this way because there are local rules that allow for us to provide some unredacted footage, for example, to defense attorneys? How comfortable is everybody doing this and providing unredacted footage? Not so much. So we continue to work towards an entry that is filed in every case that then says to the city, you may do this, and defense attorney, if you violate this entry and if you disseminate any of this video, there's going to be sanctions. So we are constantly reviewing this, because our redaction team, the supervisor there, we probably get a visit from her about maybe once a month about how underwater they are. So we are always trying to find ways to alleviate all that pressure, all that work. So these are things that we're working towards. So that's really where we focus on that back end, because that's really the most costly, time-consuming use of the resources.
Yeah, I think if in terms of cost sharing, if I asked my counterpart at the city attorney and county attorney's office if they can contribute money to the program, they probably start crying. I mean, they're really tapped as is, just with reviewing the video. I mean, the police departments, I think, have the easy. I won't say easy, but in some ways it's a little bit easier, because we don't review as much video as the prosecutors are reviewing, and they're trying to keep up with it, and they're tapped as is, and so sharing some of those resources, in our environment is out of the question, especially with the public defenders. Paying, it would be seen as paying for evidence, for discovery, which is we just can't do. Or charging, or them paying for evidence. In terms of cost savings, I think improved technology. We haven't really seen it yet because we're still realizing what our costs are before we can look at saving them. You know, redaction technology, that is probably, in my view, there's a lot of advancements being made there, and the more that it can be automated, the less hit it has on our resources. But, you know, we have to be very concerned, you know, so Google, if you go on Google Maps and you do the street view thing, you'll see that people's faces are redacted, they're blurred out. And so they have automatic redaction, and people say, well, if Google can do it, then, you know, your vendor can, or you can. Well, you also look at Google Street View, and there'll be like a bush that's blurred out, and, you know, or you know, random things that are blurred out, or they'll miss somebody's face, or that sort of thing. So the technology, there's too much at stake for it to be totally, at this point, in the foreseeable future, to be totally entrusted to technology. So I think there'll always be some level of human review, but getting that level of review down to just watching it and not doing any of the redaction was probably in my view, the best potential for cost savings, but we'll have to wait to see in the future.
The sign of a very good program is that people are still sitting here 2 hours in, but we want to be mindful of your time. Please help me in thanking our panelists for a really, really, I think, informative discussion. I just want to say thank you to the audience members and again to the panelists. One of the real joys that I have is getting a chance to learn something when I'm sitting in these discussions, and I hope that you all had an opportunity to learn. I think it was pretty obvious to me very early on in this discussion that this is not just a panacea that you can drop into a particular setting and expect there to be no difficult issues to discuss. So I think this panel did a nice job of really sort of laying out all of some of those complexities. And so I really do want to say thank you very much for that.